Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're doing fantastic. Today, we are going to be talking about Gossip Girl, specifically Dan and Blair, and whether they were actually doomed to fail from the start. When it comes to Gossip Girl, few shows have sparked as many shipping wars and heated debates over the endgame couples. In the later seasons, where the writers threw a curveball at us, pairing Brooklyn's lonely boy Dan Humphrey with the queen bee of the Upper East Side, Blair, it felt completely random to a lot of people. But what if Dan and Blair weren't as random as people made them out to be? What if it wasn't just some plot device to push Chuck and Blair together or to keep the fans entertained in the later seasons, but it was something that was carefully kind of built up through the seasons? Today's video is actually extra special because I'm teaming up with fellow commentary YouTuber Serena Skybourne, and trust, we have got some hot takes. Say hi, Serena.
Hi guys! So happy to be here today.
Hey girly. Serena does really cute pop culture videos. She talks about a lot of shows, Gossip Girl, Sex and the City, Pretty Little Liars, and we surprisingly have some similar opinions. So make sure you go and check out Serena's channel for the video we made on hers. It's about Dan Humphrey and the male fantasy. We'll be discussing kind of like his relationship with all his love interests in the show. So go watch that. It's gonna be super interesting. I will link it down below in the description. Fun fact, actually, Serena and Mike's Mike, they were actually the ones who inspired me into making commentary content. If you go to my very first commentary video, you will see her name in the description, or I mentioned them in the beginning of my video. So it is a momentous day. Put it in your calendars. And also, if you would like to keep up with me on my social medias, I have an art account and I also have just general social media Instagram accounts. So go follow me on there if you would like to. Thank you. So let's get into their relationship development. Actually, both me and Serena really liked Dan and Blair as a couple. We love their slow burn romance. And I definitely think it's worth rewatching the show because there are plenty of clues actually that hinted at the fact that these two were eventually going to get together. With these little things we picked up, we kind of have this theory that the writers had planned it from the start. We have mixed feelings about Blair and Dan. Yes, they had the potential to be really cute, but the writers kept on finding ways to mess it up. It pisses me off to think about. They've kept on finding ways to ruin the relationship, sabotage them. And so let's go through the seasons, let's go through the show and see exactly how this happened.
So at the start of the show, Blair and Dan seem to hate each other. Dan doesn't operate in the same circles as them, so Blair is actually annoyed that her bestie, Serena, would even think of dating someone like Dan. While Dan, at the start of the show, sees Blair as a bully and the epitome of everything wrong with the Upper East Side. Blair dismisses him as lonely boy from Brooklyn, and they honestly barely interact. However, even as early as season 1, episode 4, there are signs that Dan and Blair are always going to connect in some way. Like they're both talking about not being able to live up to parental expectations. And in that moment, they do seem to connect outside of their class divide. I have to say, and we both agree on this, even in that tiny scene where Dan shares a moment with Blair, we both sensed like a little bit of chemistry. Once their social barriers dropped, they genuinely could connect. And where Chuck fed into the worst instincts of Blair, Dan brought out a more interesting and intellectual side of her that we hadn't really seen before. And they had more in common than they realized. Like they're both outsiders in their own ways. They both have disappointed their parents or felt abandoned by their parents. And I'm also a really big fan of the enemies to friends to lovers trope, which Dan and Blair perfectly encapsulate. Their feelings shift very gradually over time, so it's very early 2000s rom-com coded.
In season 3, even though Blair claims she has no respect for Dan, she constantly values his opinions and always wants his help during her schemes. It's kind of funny. Blair actually starts to actively seek Dan's advice, which is insane considering their season 1 dynamic. So when Blair is at NYU, struggling with the fact that she's no longer a queen bee and super surprised to see that Dan is socially thriving, which is so opposite to what it was when they were Constance and St. Jude's. So we really see an up of the ante in season 4 where they're kind of forced into close collaboration when they are both working at W magazine. The two of them find that they have really similar interests like films and they both love going to the same museums. They begin to secretly hang out, which is so funny because both of them, not just Blair, they were both embarrassed to be seen together. In episode 12 of season 4, Dan calls Blair a dictator of tastes when it comes to fashion. Is he wrong? No, and this actually makes Blair realize that maybe she does have a future in working at a fashion magazine. This is when their dynamic fully changes from enemies to potential friends. Eventually, they both realize that they actually work really, really well together. Blair kind of finally sees that Dan's talent in writing is legitimate, and Dan really admires Blair's ambition and her work ethic.
After Blair quits W magazine due to it being too stressful, she goes to see Dan at the loft and they order pizza and they watch a movie together. Now, considering that Blair literally had an eating disorder and struggles with it throughout the show, I thought it was so nice and such a testament to Dan really that she actually feels comfortable eating things in his presence, because we don't often see her eating with other people. Like, I think it shows that she feels safe with him. Dan and Blair decide to reveal to everyone that they've been hanging out in secret, and I really liked this character moment for Blair. But then Dan kisses her. At this point, it means so much to him. He knows he likes her, and she confesses that this moment is what made her realize that she wanted Chuck. Dan's imagination goes crazy when it comes to Blair, like imagining scenarios with her in his head, but Blair seems much more focused on Chuck. It seems very much one-sided at this point. One thing we do know for sure is that she does value her friendship with Dan. It's not just about being bored. I think she genuinely enjoyed spending time with him. That's why she gets annoyed when Serena notices they've been spending time together and says to Blair, "Oh, you're trying to steal Dan from me. Like, you're trying to take something of mine." And Blair's like, "You know what, Serena? This isn't about you. I'm just genuinely enjoying spending time with him. And it has nothing to do with your previous association with him." And I thought that was really good that she stood up to Serena.
So at this stage, Dan is actively pursuing Blair and waiting for her to like him back. She's still in the denial period. For a while, Dan is the one obsessing over the relationship. She is barely even entertaining him in that way. She's way too preoccupied with this love triangle between her, Louis, and Chuck. Now, this is unfortunately what ruins any chance that Dan and Blair's relationship had to properly form. There's just too many subplots going on. And at this stage, even though she is engaged to Louis, she's spending a lot of time with Dan and she seems very emotionally attached to him. So moving on to season 5, in the episode Yes Then Zero, Blair actually goes to see Dan when she's thinking and like kind of weighing her options as to whether or not she wants to leave Louis, but then she gets really upset because she realizes that Dan just expected her to leave everything, leave Louis, no questions asked. She was also angry at the fact that Dan knew Louis was just trying to protect Blair. One thing with Dan is that he tends to withhold a lot of information, especially if he thinks that there's any chance that Blair and Louis are gonna get back together, or honestly, even if there's any male threat. So Dan's actually the first one that Blair tells that she is pregnant, and he thankfully supports her through this, although she is in a very vulnerable place, and that is important to note.
She also has a lot going on at this time and is still reeling from the betrayal of Louis, who she thought at that time was actually a loved one and wouldn't betray her like that. After she decides to take a break from Louis, Blair goes to stay with Dan to avoid the paparazzi. Dan sees how heartbroken Blair is and he decides to do something selfless for her and get her together with the man she wants to be with, regardless of how she feels about him, because it's the right thing to do. Like, if she loves Chuck, then she should be with him. But as usual, regardless of what Dan did, things start to fall apart with her and Chuck anyway. Blair recovers from her accident and losing her baby very traumatically, might I add, and Dan again is the one who's truly there for her. Blair decides to go ahead with her wedding even though everyone is begging her not to, and Dan resorts to extreme measures by ruining Blair's wedding, humiliating her in the process, and lied to her about it, allowing the blame to go into someone else rather than coming clean about what he did. Now, I agree with everyone that Blair shouldn't have gone ahead with the wedding, but ultimately she should have the autonomy to make that decision, and she didn't ask to be saved. There was a video aired at the wedding of Blair telling Chuck that she still loved him, and obviously Louis, upon seeing that video, would never want to be with Blair. He then reveals that he no longer loves her, which really upsets Blair, so she turns to Dan to help her escape the wedding. He brings her to the airport so they can secretly escape the country and she can get a divorce, and then he takes her to a hotel whilst they wait for the next flight. It seemed like he really wanted it to be the two of them. He really seemed reluctant to even tell his dad what they were doing or to tell his friends. Like, he didn't want anyone to know where she was.
So then in episode 15, Blair gets mad at Serena because she thinks that she's the one who sent this horrific video into the wedding. It's kind of messed up when you think about it, that Dan would be so willing to pit these two friends against each other. In the same episode, Blair is actually still in denial about her feelings for Dan, but then he kisses her and she surprises herself by kissing him back. And despite her feelings, she tells him that they cannot get together because of the dowry and because of the prenup. So moving on to the episode Crossroads, Blair kisses Dan and unfortunately, Serena is there to witness it. It was a good kissing scene though. They both finally realize their mutual feelings for each other and Blair and Dan enter into a relationship.
Soon after, they attempt to consummate their relationship and they're both shocked when it goes terribly, awkwardly wrong. Now, I don't know why the first time was so bad. They both make a point that it was just really awkward and bad. But the weird thing is, they get a bit tipsy and they try it again a second time and then they seem to love it and there doesn't seem to be a problem. Were they both feeling too nervous the first time to truly enjoy it? I don't know. In the episode It Girl Interrupted, Blair reveals to Dan that she's hesitating to sign her divorce papers because she's not quite ready to give up being a princess just yet. And Dan, to try and make her happy, basically gets her this little tiara to wear out and about so that she'll feel confident in herself because she's a princess to him. He even dresses her up in a gown and brings her to the Met steps to meet some fans of hers. It was super, super cute. I love this scene. In one of the episodes after that, I think it's Salon of the Dead, they start to have a bit of a clash around whose world they would truly fit into and who should have to make more sacrifices to fit into the other's world. But they're barely together, by the way, before things start to disintegrate again in episode 22. It was honestly so brief that it felt like a fever dream.
Also, Dan is offered a fellowship in Rome, Italy for the summer. He does invite Blair, but she kind of like dances around, giving him an answer. And Dan unfortunately finds out that Blair is back scheming with Chuck behind his back. Now, unfortunately, especially in her relationship with Dan, she has zero respect for the boundaries concerning contacting exes, and Dan is still operating under this delusion that Blair's scheming ways are in the past, that she no longer does that anymore. But frankly, it has and continues to be a huge part of Blair's identity. She is a schemer. She just can't give it up, and this actually makes Dan so hesitant to go to Italy because he realizes that he does not trust her. Now, she agrees to go to Italy with Dan despite Dan wondering why she hasn't said I love you back. And Dan honestly can be very pushy, and you really can't pressure people into saying these things just because you feel it. Like, people are on different timelines. He's being pushy. Relax. And let's be real, Dan does have the tendency to catch feelings really quickly. He has a tendency to say I love you super early into relationships.
And unfortunately, if you look at it from the point of view of Dan being Gossip Girl, this makes no sense, by the way. It gets really unsettling because shortly after, pages from Blair's diary were leaked. And in those pages, Blair basically admits that her relationship with Dan was good and intellectually stimulating, but she feared that she would never care about anyone as much as she loved Chuck. Now that we know Dan was Gossip Girl, why would he leak these pages and then act all shocked and fake surprised at what she said?
It kind of seems like Dan did this to get rid of Blair, that all along he was using her as a pawn to break up her and Serena's friendship. He was fully aware that Blair would never truly love him, and he didn't care. Dan knew that if their friendship crumbled, Serena would be incredibly vulnerable and would most likely fall into her old self-destructive patterns, and his little stalker endgame plan was to get her back. And to seal the deal, Dan tells Serena that he never wants to see her again. It's like his whole master plan was to return from Italy and strike. Frankly, being with Blair elevated him in the social hierarchy, and Serena saw this, and she was so used to being desired by Dan. Finally, it looked like he was moving on. Dan's entire arc in the later seasons could actually be seen as him carefully manipulating Serena, breaking her down so that she would eventually choose him. This seems really dark, even for Gossip Girl, which kind of tells me that, yeah, this reveal probably wasn't planned from the beginning.
In the finale, Dan gives her an ultimatum, and he tells her that if she truly loves him, she will meet him at the shepherd's divorce party to tell him that. And ultimatums like this, I think, are very weird, very controlling and transactional, and they don't really allow the other person to truly express their genuine feelings. He's afraid of losing Blair, but in a way that makes me think there's not much to hold on to. Like, he knows that a lot of her feelings for him have come from his manipulation as opposed to it being genuine. She debates whether or not to go, but chooses to ultimately end it to pursue her relationship with Chuck instead. And that tells me that she never truly wanted Dan, or she would have chosen to be with him, but she consistently chooses Chuck over him. There was a bit of an overlap here because she hadn't fully left Dan at the time, even though she knew she wanted to, like she knew she wanted Chuck. But around this time, Dan hooks up with Serena when he's drunk, although to be clear, I don't like to use the word cheating here because in my mind, Serena very much pursued and like seduced him in this scene, and he could already tell that Blair wasn't really feeling it.
Now moving on to season 6, the two have not seen each other all summer, but Dan is still trying to win this girl back. Stop. Take a pause, take a breather. He really regrets the fling with Serena and he felt used, but he definitely does not want Blair finding out. Dan knows that Blair would never get back with him if she knew that he slept with Serena. Now, Blair is not an angel by any means. She definitely showed her fair share of toxic behaviors, most especially this like nonsensical push and pull relationship, toxic ass relationship that she had with Chuck. And the thing with Chuck is that it really seems like he had way more respect for all of his love interests aside from Blair. It's like he knew that she would just always be there. Like with Raina and Eva, he knew never to cross the line or to play with them. He saw Raina as this like incredible independent businesswoman, and he literally worshipped Eva as this angelic woman that inspired him to be better. Whereas with Blair, he kind of just always assumed that she would wait on him, just wait on the back burner until he was ready. And that's why this line by Dan in season 6 hits so hard. You had someone who loved you unconditionally, treated you right, wanted to be with you every day. And then you threw that all away to let Chuck Bass decide when he's ready for you. You think you have an epic love, but all you have is excuses. Is he wrong? Is he wrong?
After basically becoming homeless, Dan asks Blair if he can stay with her for a while, and she agrees. This moment in season 6 seems like one of Dan's creepiest and most manipulative moments regarding Blair because it seems oriented around planting doubt in her mind about Chuck and her relationship with Chuck. As we know, Blair and Chuck had agreed that they would only be together once he'd grown up, once she'd grown up, and once he had fully resolved his issues with his father. So Dan writes an expose about Chuck and his battle with his father, but leaves Blair out of it entirely, which I'm sure he's not an idiot. He would know would tap into her very deep insecurities around maybe being irrelevant in Chuck's story. It again would reinforce her biggest insecurity that Chuck will always put business and revenge above his relationship with her. And later at Cotillion, he tells Blair to ask Chuck about it, even though he already knows that Chuck isn't going. And so to me, this is a psychological trick, again, setting her up for disappointment.
And then he offers to take her to Cotillion, which again seems a little bit manipulative because he's framing himself as Blair's only option, planting the idea that Chuck will never truly be there for her. But Dan always will be. She kicks him out of her apartment and she ends up struggling with their friendship when his sex tape with Serena airs at the ball in episode 5. When Blair finds out the truth, Dan just scrambles to salvage his plan. His final move is twisting the knife even deeper by telling Blair that she ended up with no one.
You ended up with no one. Chuck will never be finished fighting with his father, and that ring around your neck is never going to be on your finger.
Her response is the ultimate rejection.
I would rather be with no one than with you.
Huh?
Well, yes. She is finally calling him out on his manipulation. Did Dan ever love Blair, or did he just want to beat Chuck and prove that he was better, superior to the Upper East Side elite? Dan always thought and made it very clear that he thought Chuck was so bad for Blair. He didn't trust her to make her own decisions. He believed that he was the only one who knew what was best for her. And this is a key trait of having a savior complex. He needed to be the rescuer from her bad relationships because he believed she deserved better.
Blair tries to convince Serena not to get back together with Dan because at this point she thinks he's bad news. Serena doesn't even believe her until this awful serial basically slamming her comes out. Afterwards, Blair, Serena, everyone start to ice Dan out. They start to pull away from him because they don't trust him anymore. Blair didn't react as badly to her portrayal in the book because it was a more positive representation. But Serena is very negatively affected by Dan's book and is actually considering moving to Los Angeles to escape from it.
Blair has nothing positive to say about Dan anymore. It does get kind of boring because she reverts back to her original position like she did in season 1, wherein Dan is trash and he will never be one of us, one of the Upper East Siders. It's as if she never even knew him. In the season finale, Dan is present when Blair gets married to Chuck, not looking too happy, might I add. Now, Dan and Serena's wedding takes place after the 5-year time jump in Chuck and Blair's apartment. The audience is kind of set to believe that in that time jump, he got over Blair and was able to really reignite his love for Serena. I don't know about that. I kind of doubt it. It definitely could be said that maybe he did it. Maybe he settled because Blair truly didn't want him anymore. Now on to our overall thoughts.
A lot of the die-hard fans of this show tried to convince themselves that Dan and Blair were meant to be, that they were the best couple, and that they would have been endgame, and that in fact they were a healthy couple. But they forget that Blair didn't invest in the relationship half as much as Dan did. And knowing Blair, she would never settle for someone unless she knew that they had money.
Girlie has high standards.
Right? Like, she bullied Dan and his sister for years because of their social class. She was even embarrassed when Serena reminded her that she had dated him in the finale, as if none of that had happened. Georgina described Blair dating Dan as losing her mind, which is a really frustrating characterization because it implies that the most rational thing to do is choose someone like Chuck. But in fact, in those moments when she wasn't with Chuck, I would argue that Blair was at her most rational because she wasn't choosing a toxic, awful man who treated her terribly. And it sends the message that everything has to ultimately lead her back to Chuck, regardless of how damaging this will be for her.
However, throughout the show, despite her disdain for him, whenever she needed him, he was there. Now, whether that was due to his savior complex for rich, pretty girls in distress, or because she was Serena's friend, we won't ever know. But he showed up. And when they did spend time together and she actually took him seriously for 2 seconds, they were kind of the best couple in the entire show. Don't shoot me. He forced Blair to confront her biases. However, I will say I do think the build up to the relationship was the best part of it. I loved watching them as friends, bonding over topics like film and literature, which we didn't really see them talk too much about with other people. And they were both clearly so passionate about these topics, and it was great to see. I also really found that both actors have really good comedic timing, and I loved watching their banter back and forth. You know, I love their improvised dialogue, and it was so fun seeing more of that in the 4th season, especially when they're in that like friendship situationship period, that will they won't they period, when they kissed for the first time and we're wondering whether these were actually real feelings. That was just so fun to watch. I'm sorry, I loved it. I was pleased. Blair's elitist jokes remained, of course, but she was so much softer towards him. And it's always nice to watch someone's walls like break down. When they both had their first kiss and realized that they were like nothing more than friends and that the kiss meant nothing, Blair even found herself defending her relationship to Serena. She said, "I'm sorry to break it to you, but Dan and I have a real connection. We did things like visit the Dia and debate Chabrol versus Romero, things we could never do with you." Ouch. She has a point though.
Even before Dare happened, Blair did acknowledge that her life with Chuck was mostly darkness. She said she only felt true joy and happiness after cutting him off. Chuck was very possessive over Blair. He literally sold her for a hotel. Okay, granted, this was before the Chuck in Prague arc where he finds Eva and becomes a good person. What about before that? There were so many opportunities where Blair was ready for a relationship. She did like him, and she was basically begging him to change, and he wouldn't. It was only after she left him that he changed up his act a while later, but why? Why wasn't Blair good enough for him to do that prior? And why did he leave it so long to finally start to do right by her? And by that point, she'd already moved on. By the time Dan and Blair also finally started dating, Blair was in like a love triangle situation. Like, there was Louis, but there was also Dan, and then there was Chuck. Like, she was juggling relationships with multiple men, which didn't give much time for her relationship with Dan to be fully explored. Dan and Blair were barely a thing, nor did the writers actually give them a chance to develop. If I was writing season 5, I think there were too many romantic subplots going on. I think it was confusing. And we both agreed that the best thing to do would be to scrap Louis for a while, end his arc earlier because it was getting boring, and actually allow more of season 5 to be dedicated to exploring a relationship between Dan and Blair. I think they should have gotten more screen time to give it a chance and explore if there actually is something there, or he would just never stand a chance compared to Chuck.
Keep in mind that most of the really kind gestures that Chuck did for Blair, like making her prom queen, applying to Columbia for her, paying her dowry, these were things that were done in secret that Blair was not supposed to know about. Granted, these are great things to do, don't get me wrong, but one thing Blair values, and I'm sure we can all agree on that, is having her own agency. Most especially after he chose to trade her for a hotel. Yeah, can't forget about that. After him trading her for a hotel in season 3, I can see why Blair would never ever want to feel again that she owed him anything. Dan, on the other hand, was shown to value her independence. He was very vocal about his feelings for her. Serena actually said, Skybourne, not Serena Vanderwoodson. She actually said that one of her favorite scenes in the entire show was when he took her to the steps, put the princess tiara on her so that she could feel like the queen bee one last time. So no, they didn't have that toxic, intensely passionate love like Cher or Serena, but it was calm. It was stable, and I loved to see it. Had Dan not be revealed to be Gossip Girl, I would have been a lot more pissed that Dare wasn't Endgame, but just knowing that Dan was pulling the strings and manipulating everybody behind the scenes the whole time, I really can't be too mad that Blair ended up with Chuck.
Overall, I do think Dan will be happy with Serena because, you know, they have history, they could make it work, you know, they were childhood teenage sweethearts, like there's a lot that they have in common. But if Dan really got what he wanted, I think he would have ended up with Blair. He loved Blair, she was smart, she was wealthy, she was powerful, she was the kind of person he wanted to be. And they could bond over film and literature, which was this new side of Blair that we'd never seen. With Dan and Blair, she was actually the focal point, whereas with Chuck and Blair, she was constantly dragged into Chuck's schemes. Dan truly idolized and admired her, which I liked because at points it felt like Chuck was very cold and dismissive.
Now, Blair and Chuck were entertaining. I completely understand why people rooted for them, but he didn't treat her well. Now, I won't deny that Chuck and Blair were really fun to watch at first. Layton and Ed had the best chemistry in the entire show, but after the millionth "we can't be together because X," it just became super exhausting. The constant cycle of breakup, angst, angry makeup sex just became exhausting. Dan, on the other hand, genuinely cared for Blair. Even during their interning days, he stepped aside because they were competing for the same position and he knew that she wanted it more. He recognized that her goals, her ambitions, they meant more to her than they would ever mean to him, and he let her have them without any resentment. However, Blair never really respected Dan. She didn't even read his book. Overall, it really just seemed like a fantasy on Dan's part. Like, she didn't even say "I love you" to him. She never told him "I love you." Maybe if the writers had introduced Dan and Blair earlier, before Cher became a fan favorite, they could have been endgame. Even Leighton Meester herself has said that Blair was her true self when she was with Dan.
And the only reason he even married Serena was because Blair chose Chuck, and I genuinely believe this. Even at Dan's own wedding, his energy was low. He seemed unenthusiastic. I love the concept of Dan and Blair, but the way it was executed undermined the entire idea. Like them liking each other, developing something, only for it to unravel very, very quickly, and then for them to go back to their initial disdain of each other. And this even ruined their friendship in the process, which is really sad because I like their friendship. Another common misconception is that Dan and Blair were just a really healthy couple, and this just isn't true. They were relatively healthy up until the point where Dan began to feel threatened. Imagine my surprise rewatching season 5 when I realized how manipulative Dan could get even in his seemingly healthy relationship with Blair. He isolated Blair all of season 5, he wanted to be her savior, and he didn't want anyone to know about it. And I think he enjoyed the idea of them running away without anyone being in on it or knowing what was going on.
Now, it's so easy to forget that this happened because it was so easily swept to the side in the show, but Dan was the one who sent in the video to Gossip Girl that ruined Blair and Louis' wedding. Granted, Dan is Gossip Girl, but at the time we didn't know. Not only did he ruin the wedding, he let Serena and Chuck take the fall instead. And what did he gain from this? Like, seriously. He didn't trust Blair to be loyal to him without seeing Chuck, which is why he would kind of constantly just follow her around. Every single time they spent together, it was either in Brooklyn, her apartment, or some one-on-one scenario. Part of this was due to the fact that he really had to force things with her to keep this momentum going, because when they started dating, Blair never really reassured him that she wanted him. Blair's relationship with Dan in the show is described as temporary insanity, which I think really just speaks volumes. Dan also told Blair something along the lines of Chuck is manipulating her to be with him in a form of financial abuse because he paid her dowry, which is blatantly untrue because he didn't even want her to know about it. Like, he wanted that to be kept a secret. It was a secret gesture of love, whatever that means for Chuck. He also told Blair that Chuck is to blame for her getting arrested, which was just untrue. He wanted to eliminate all rivals because he was insecure.
It could be said that Dan just picked the wrong time to choose Blair, who was obviously just divorced, reeling from the loss of her unborn child, then the whole disillusionment of her failed relationship with Chuck, having a massive dowry that would bankrupt her family. Perhaps this was the first time that Dan saw this strong woman as someone vulnerable. And instead of just being a good friend and being what she needed, he chose to take it a step further into romantic territory. Putting this all into context, it made sense as to why she never reassured him. But I found it very interesting that in contrast, Dan and Serena's off-and-on relationship, their main point of contention was that they were from different worlds. Yes, Serena was a rich girl, but she was very like down to earth, and she connected with people outside of their class, like she would date anyone, whereas Blair was the complete opposite, and she made it very clear to everyone, especially Dan, that she was basically destined to marry royalty. She bullied Dan and Jenny for years, and yet he still managed to fall for her. And I guess Dan and Serena's relationship and Blair and Dan's relationship both fell apart due to class differences in the end.
And Blair never really made it evident that she truly valued anything he had to offer, yet he chased her until he was no longer wanted. I truly wonder what it is about Serena that made him so insecure in his social standing that he did not also see in Blair. Obviously, like, both of the girls had very similar upbringings. Could it be that Dan was similar to Blair in that he didn't value his standing in society because he didn't come from wealth? It seems like him and Blair kind of had that in common. Did Dan agree with all those things that she would say to him before they became friends, mocking him for his lack of wealth? With Dan's social climbing tendencies, I would not be surprised if he did.
For whatever reason, the writers allowed all of Blair's main relationships to delve into toxicity. As much as her love interests sacrificed things and seemed to care for her, there was always a point where they felt the need to take Blair's livelihood into their own hands. At first, they love her sass, her mind, her assertiveness, her independence, but at one point or another, their ego takes a hold, healthy communications stop, and then the schemes start.
If I were in the writer's room back then, I would have loved to see Blair choosing herself at the end of the series. Just picture it. Blair has finally had enough of Chuck's mischief. She witnesses Bart Bass plunge to his death after the altercation with Chuck in the series finale. She decides not to keep this life-altering secret for him, decides not to marry him on a whim while outrunning the cops. She prioritizes herself and not the man that has done her wrong more times than I can count. And in the flash forward scene towards the end of the episode, we see that she has become a millionaire, a billionaire powerhouse in the fashion industry. How amazing would that be? Throughout the show, Blair was shown to be a conniving, dominating, hard worker. If she showed passion for anything throughout the series, aside from Chuck, it was her career. I know this probably isn't the most popular take, but she was also just like severely mistreated by pretty much all her romantic interests in the show. And I personally would have loved to see a full circle moment in the show where she finds herself, she achieves her dreams, and if/when the right man comes into her life, it's blissful, it's fun, it's easy, it's non-toxic, a la Eleanor Waldorf and Cyrus Rose.
I also think that with Dan being Gossip Girl, they never would have worked because we find out that he's been pulling strings the whole time. It feels so out of character for everyone in that room to just move on from this revelation so quickly. Dan ruined their lives for years, bullied them, tormented them, and yet these are apparently people that he cared so much for. Blair is the only one who pushes back, saying, guys, Gossip Girl ruined our lives, and had Blair and Dan ended up together, I don't think that she ever would have moved past that. Plus, it really puts a taint on all those genuine times Blair had with Dan, because it turns out that he was manipulating her the entire time with this whole high and mighty facade, pretending he's better than them, you know? And he's been like working against them the whole time.
Now, this couple could be very, very cute at times, and they had the potential to be great. But it really does seem like both characters use each other in ways that weren't entirely healthy. Dan is often motivated by a need to prove himself in Blair's world, while Blair's dependence on Dan may have been more about avoiding dealing with her feelings with Chuck than actually having feelings for him, like true feelings for him. Had they been given a fair shot, had Dan not been turned insanely manipulative in season 5, had Dan not been Gossip Girl, I really would have loved to see how they would have turned out. And I know that's based on a lot of ifs. I know this show was written in a different time, but I would have loved to see how the relationship could have actually like properly progressed. This is unfortunate because Dan was corrupt from the very beginning and it would never have worked. That being said, before we knew Dan was a manipulative freak, we both loved their arc. Now, what do you guys think? Do you agree? I know we had like lots of theories in this show. We kind of delved deep into it at times. We just think it's like fun to theorize. We think it's fun to like really dive deep into the show. Yeah, the show is written in a different time, but it's a show that's still available for us to watch. And as we get older, as society progresses, we have different feelings and we like to share them. So that's what we're gonna do. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you so much again to Serena for joining me for this video.
Thank you guys. I love chatting with Shay about the show and I had so much fun.
I hope you guys liked it. Now do not forget to go to Serena's channel and watch our second video on Dan and the female fantasy, and also subscribe to Serena's channel. Follow us on both of our socials. They will be down below and mine will also be at the end of the video. And thank you so much for watching. Bye.